Champlain actually worked for 7 different organizations through his career. And what I'm going to do is run through a lot of the details relating to his life. Ultimately, his time on Georgian Bay was approximately 2 3/4 days. He encountered, as his group on August, maybe late July, early August of 1615, he encountered 300 Ottawa picking blueberries on the French River. And he was really surprised at how many people were out there picking blueberries. So if you think that blueberries and blueberry picking is a new tradition on Georgian Bay, it's been going on for a long time, and it really surprised Champlain. Champlain describes his time on Georgian Bay as basically a canoe trip through islands and inhospitable rock that was of no use for agriculture whatsoever. So his cumulative impressions of La Mer Douce, the freshwater sea that he names Lake of the Hurons, is ultimately not all that impressive until he gets into Wendat and begins to realize just how agricultural the Wendat. The Wendat are the name of the Huron people. The French basically call anybody west of the Ottawa River a Huron. I like to think of the term as ruffian or country people, as opposed to the native groups, the Montagnais and the Algonquians that Champlain was familiar with along the Ottawa, or the lower Ottawa and the St. Lawrence. So, who was Samuel de Champlain? A man of colossal scope. He's an administrator, a soldier, an explorer, a cartographer, a writer, and a promoter of New France. He's certainly in on the very earliest wave of Europeans to encounter a great number of Canada's first peoples. He's also charter of coasts and waterways. This is one of the earliest, what I call comprehensive maps. It's really interesting that he has used a lot of Henry Hudson's detail as well as his own detail, and he has surveyed from basically Nantucket all the way to Labrador in the approximately 10 years before he actually produces this map. He's also a writer. This is his first book, Des Sauvages by Champlain, written in 1603, and it's probably the most important travel writing document of the 17th century. It really promotes coming to the New World, despite the fact that by the time he died in 1635, the French incorporated about 150 people in the new colony, whereas Virginia and Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Virginia Company probably had something in the neighborhood of 2,500 individuals. He is also the founder of the habitation at Quebec. So this is really, it's not the first buildings of a French style in Canada, but ultimately it's the source of the origins of Quebec City, which is an extraordinarily important community in the country. And in 1613, he wrote, "It is this art, navigation, which has drawn me to love the sea at a very young age, that compelled me to challenge its treacherous waters all of my life, and that made me navigate and follow the coasts of parts of America." So, was he a captain? Well, he was a captain representing the king. He was a lieutenant. He was a lieutenant general representing the king, but he was not a captain of the French Navy. He never drove or was captain of a ship, despite the fact that he traveled 23 times across the Atlantic in his career. So he loved what I call the art of navigation. And we think this is what Champlain might have looked like. He was a soldier. He was all of these wonderful things, but ultimately there is no painting and there is no likeness. So these are fictitious elements. This is one that was done at the 300th anniversary of Champlain. The one that I showed you previously is on the front of this very large book up here, and it was done for the 400th anniversary. So who knows what he's going to look like for the 500th anniversary. The early years. We know that Champlain was born on the 13th of August, 1574. This was discovered in the La Rochelle archives by a genealogist 2 years ago. He's the son of a sea captain from Brouage, located along the Atlantic coast of France. This is the seaport town of Brouage, and what's really interesting is the river has now basically silted up, and the Atlantic has moved out some 3 or 4 miles from the actual city itself. And what made Brouage famous were all the salt marshes. And so Brouage manufactured salt, and every boat that went to America, all the fishing boats, all the whaling boats, they stopped in here to pick up all their salt, which would cure the fish that they would then bring back and sell. This is Champlain's birth certificate. This is the document in which this genealogist was going through, and this is the actual certificate for Champlain. We never knew when he was born. Some people estimated he could have been born as early as 1576, maybe as late as 1580. But as I say, 2 years ago, in an archive, we actually found the date of his birth. So, in his time in Brouage, he probably attended a school that was more for the formation of soldiers and cartographers and surveyors than he would have had he had a classical education. Whereas Marc Lescarbot, who is a contemporary of Champlain, was actually a classically trained. So he's bringing in all sorts of metaphors and idioms related to the Greeks and the Romans. Samuel de Champlain did not have that kind of an education. If you can generalize, he probably went to a community college of roughly 2 years and graduated from that, and about 1589, he joined the army. And the army at the time, Henry IV was fighting to gain the crown of France from a cousin, and France had gone through horrible Protestant versus Catholic wars, but he became a furrier. Now, what is a furrier? Well, it's a guy that draws maps, and maps of fortifications, maps of military troop movements, and maps as to where soldiers are going to be billeted. And he would likely go around and chalk out on houses where soldiers of Henry IV would be billeted during their various movements around France. So he's in the quartermaster's department, if you will. He is not a soldier that picks up a gun and actually fights, at least to the best of our knowledge, that is the case. Champlain fulfills a number of obligations for Henry IV. He does a number of missions on Henry IV's behalf. At some point, he is presented to the court of Henry IV. Some authors have suggested that maybe Henry IV was the father of Champlain. I don't think there's any reason to think that that's the case. After the wars in 1598, Henry IV asks Champlain to go to the West Indies. He wants to know what the Spanish are doing in the West Indies. And Champlain's uncle, a ship's captain, is prepared to take Champlain to the West Indies. So he leaves from Brevat and goes to Cadiz, and this is a picture of some of the military fortifications of Cadiz, and goes to the port of Havana. Now, the Spanish would always organize large groups of ships at one time to go across the Atlantic. That way they could protect them. They would do the same thing coming back, so you don't have a bunch of ships haphazardly going all over the place. They would go in a convoy, and when they arrived at Havana, Havana was sort of the jumping off point for all of the Spanish West Indies. It is purported that Champlain went as far as Mexico City. So he was there for approximately 3 years and came back to Henry IV, and Henry IV appointed him to the Hydrographic Department. Now, is he a royal hydrographer? Probably not, but he is in the Hydrographic Department, and he reports to Henry IV all that he has seen from 1598 to 1601, and provides Henry probably with the ideas of expanding and developing a colonial empire. France had done that under Francis I in the 1520s and the 1530s with both Verrazano and ultimately with Cartier and Roberval, but that was up to about 1545, and France did nothing in terms of a colonial development, more or less with respect to Canada, until Champlain is sent over with a group in 1603 to the port of Tadoussac, and Tadoussac is in Quebec, and this is the representation of the small fort at Tadoussac. Champlain was sent as an observer. He didn't have a specific function, and so he is surveying the greater St. Lawrence Basin in order to determine what might be the best location for a permanent colony. He returns to France, gives another report to Henry IV, and the trip of 1603 constitutes Tadoussac. He maps, he goes all the way to Montreal, comes back, goes to Gaspésie, goes around Newfoundland. He's looking at surveying and trying to determine what the best location for a French colony would be. This is a picture of the Lachine Rapids, or the St. Louis Rapids. This is as far as Champlain could go in pinnaces. Later on, he'll be the second European to actually shoot this in a canoe. Etienne Brulé is the first. But fascinating, that is the end, if you will, of the ships being able to go up the St. Lawrence, and these rapids stopped everybody, and this ultimately becomes the location where Champlain begins to meet native groups. He holds what's called a Debauchee. Debauchees are trading fairs in which everyone is encouraged to come in and trade, and these Debauchees would result in a permanent facility in Montreal. He also, in 1603, writes Des Sauvages and publishes it. In 1604 through 1607, he has pretty well done the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Now he's going to survey most of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Maine, and Massachusetts. He goes as far south as Cap Blanc or Nantucket, and ultimately he surveys where the Pilgrims are going to land in 1621. So it's rather interesting that a Frenchman would set the way for the Pilgrims. But at any rate, they're looking for places that latitudinally and longitudinally are going to work, because the winters up in Canada are absolutely brutal. So this is the habitation that Champlain establishes on St. Croix Island, and many people suffered disease and scurvy, at this site, and so they moved across to Port Royal, and the Port Royal habitation 1605, 1606, 1607. This gives you an idea of what these habitation sites would look like. And this is Champlain's detailed map of Acadia, and this is the first time that all of the major rivers and all of the surveying of southern Nova Scotia and Maine is actually put into a formal map, and of course he publishes it. Port Royal is right in here on a valley in Nova Scotia, okay, probably right in here. To the French, this region was known as Acadia. In 1608, on Champlain's recommendations, Pierre de Guy Dumont is the fur trader holding the monopoly, and Champlain together they establish Quebec in 1608, and here he is purportedly looking at drawings and trying to figure out how to develop the fur trade, make really good relationships with the natives, establish treaties. Just a few comments on the fur trade. The fur trade is much more than just the central beaver pelts that you see here. Lynx, marten, mink, seal, as well as caribou, elk, deer, bear, fox, a whole range of furs were traded. Also feathers. What a lot of people don't realize is the furriers would take the pelt or pelts and create apparel products, and then they would be improved by the haberdashers, and the haberdashers would add bands, silk, buttons, feathers to improve, if not double or triple, the value of a hat. So this is making beaver hats in Paris from a lithograph, and you can see the various styles of hats. And here, the problem with the process of developing these furs is that they used mercury, and ultimately mercury will give you Minamata disease if you're exposed to it too much. So there were very set parameters on how long you could be exposed to the mercury process of setting the hides. So this is the industry that really drove the fur trade. Traditionally, Europe got most of its hides from Russia and the Muscovy Company, but about 1575, political problems in Russia really improved the North American demand for furs in places like Paris, and so slowly those whaling ships and those fishing ships probably participated in the fur trade, but then the fur trade became more and more economic, and ultimately individuals would participate in the fur trade. Champlain also fulfilled his native obligations. In 1609, he participated with his Huron, Montagnais, and Algonquin allies on an attack against the Iroquois. And you can see these are the Europeans with their guns. And of course, the Iroquois were not used to weapons, and one shot supposedly taken by Champlain or one of his men killed 2 Iroquois chiefs almost immediately. And that resulted in the complete rout of the Iroquois. It also made sure that Champlain and the Iroquois, or the French, despite Champlain's later efforts, would always be antagonistic toward each other. In 1610, Champlain sent a young Truchement. This is Etienne Brûlé, or supposedly Etienne Brûlé, to live with Iroquois up the Ottawa River. Iroquois actually winters with one of the nations of the Huron, and so In 1611, he came back to the Debauchee at Lachine Rapids or St. Louis Rapids and told Champlain about these fantastic people called the Hurons. Ultimately, Champlain wanted to try to develop a relationship with the Huron. They have 4 nations, and they are the Atignawantan, Atinganonganak, Tohono-Ronrat, and the Arendoronoho, or roughly the bear, the deer, the cord, and the rock. And the various individuals from the Huron nations would attend these Debauchees more or less independently. The coordination of trade doesn't seem to be a pan-Huron experience, but rather individual nations. So we think these trading fairs were significantly important, not only to the natives, but ultimately to Champlain, because Champlain now has, under these various monopolistic companies, periods where there's free trade, periods where Honfleur or Dieppe or St. Malo or La Rochelle are trying to compete to destroy the monopolies, so it gets quite complicated. Also in 1610, Champlain, the 17th of December, marries by a prearranged marriage, Hélène Boulle, and Hélène is 12 years old. And Sam, if you can do the quick math, I think he's about 36. So these prearranged marriages were common in the 16th and 17th centuries. Her parents provided a 6,000 pound or livre dowry, of which Champlain got 4,500 upon completion of the dowry. And what Champlain is trying to do is legitimize and professionalize his working relationship with the court. Henry IV was assassinated in early 1610. Champlain has to come back and deal with Marie de Medici, and ultimately he feels that getting married is probably in his best interests. It's also not a bad financial deal, and there is a codicil that he can't live with her for 2 years. Champlain probably did 23 or 24 maps over the period of 30 years in Canada. And this is one of his maps of the greater Montreal area, which of course he figured was the outlet to China. Champlain was really interested in finding the route to China. Champlain publishes Les Voyages, and very, very important book, again, another travel log. One of the most interesting things, Champlain not only publishes 4 books in his life and maybe 23 or 24 maps, but he does an awful lot of other things as well. But we have the ability to really understand what Champlain and the French were trying to do because of his writings. In 1609, now that the establishment of Quebec is secure, Champlain goes down the Richelieu and or the Iroquois River, now called the Richelieu River, and discovers Lake Champlain, which of course he calls after himself. In 1613, he goes up the Ottawa. This is the first time that not the first time that a European has gone up the Ottawa. Etienne Brûlé did that in 1610, but Champlain was really interested in trying again to conduct Western exploration. And he gets all the way to Allumette Island, where one of his truchements, Nicolas Vigneault, develops a real problem with the natives that he's staying with. What Nicolas Vigneault says is that there have been 8 Europeans found on a saltwater sea much to the north of the Ottawa River. And of course, anyone knows the history. Henry Hudson was working up in the what is now Hudson Bay and James Bay, and of course there was a mutiny and 8 people were cut adrift. And Champlain thinks that this might be the route to the northern sea. Then in 1615, he makes the big trip up the Ottawa, across the Mattawa, Lake Nipissing, down the French, and then down into Wendake or Huronia. He then goes down to participate in a battle against the Onondaga, where he's wounded in the knee to the point where he cannot walk, and he is carried back to Huronia. Well, Champlain really wanted, upon completion of his attack, which he considered to be a complete failure, and all his allies considered to be a major victory, he wanted to go back down this way. But the Wendat would not let him go, number one, because he was wounded, and number two, because they were too concerned that the Mohawk could intercept him. And if he were killed, that would destroy all of the work that not only Champlain, but all these native groups had developed in the various treaties that they were working on. So he was physically brought back to Wendake. While there, he then went over to visit the Piton, another nation of two nations, another confederacy of Iroquois-speaking peoples that lived in the greater Collingwood area. So the Wendat are four nations living in Wendake or Huronia, and he also visits the Ottawa and the Piton, and so that's why there's this little trail. And then in May of 1616, he retraces the route and returns to Quebec City. Champlain also finds a group of religious called the Recollets in Paris, and the Recollets are the first religious order to actually serve in the interior. The Jesuits were working in Acadia, but the Jesuits were not asked to participate in the Canadian, what I call the upper Canadian missions, until 1625, when Montmorency and the Duc de Ventadour decides that he wants the Jesuits. So the Recollets and Father Joseph Le Caron actually come up with Champlain to Huronia in 1615 and says the first Mass, I believe on August 2nd in north of Midland. So this is the Recollet. Champlain had organized the fact that religious salvation would be something that the native inhabitants would want. They asked for priests, and that was the result. This is the attack of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee village in 1615, and Champlain makes the little sort of fortress to be able to shoot into the village. The Wendat attack with fire, but ultimately the village withstands the attack. Champlain considers it to be a major defeat, but the Wendat were able to capture a few Iroquois, and the whole idea of warfare as annihilation versus showing strength is a completely different philosophical take that natives had versus the Europeans. And this is a great shot in that lithograph of an armed soldier, and these are probably matchlocks. The flintlock is only developed in 1610 and takes a little while to get into general distribution. So here you have somebody that's going by canoe over 1,000 kilometers, and he's got all his armor, he's got his guns, he's got his sword, he's got his helmet. So these guys must have really looked unusual to the First Nations groups that encountered these soldiers. Okay, Champlain the administrator. Champlain is wounded in this battle with the Onondaga in 1615, and we think that had a role to play on Champlain assuming greater administrative responsibilities. And what he tries to do as an administrator is develop the colony. He tries to create, he makes a real effort to try to make peace with the Iroquois through the 1620s. He is unsuccessful, more or less unsuccessful. At least there's no warfare, but I don't think the Iroquois considered him to be a great individual. Champlain also brings his wife in 1620 over to live in Canada. and she lasts 5 years. It goes back to France. Champlain, we think, probably had the nicest time of his life with his wife here in Canada. She got very interested in native girls and educating them. Also, Louis XIII really becomes king. Champlain is his lieutenant general, so he's reporting directly to Louis. And Cardinal Richelieu in 1626 decides that all of these different monopolies are a pain. They lack the funding, so he develops what's called the Company of 100 Associates, and in 1627, Champlain becomes his lieutenant general. So it's very important to realize that Champlain was the king's representative in Canada for both Henry IV and Louis XIII. So he really is the king's man. And Champlain is one of the investors of the 100 Associates. Now in 1629, because as a result of this Company of 100 Associates, this gentleman, Gervais Kirk, and his 5 sons, David Kirk, eventually they basically put an embargo on the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they capture all the 100 Associate ships coming over to victual and bring more inhabitants to the region. And in 1629, finally in July, Champlain capitulates and hands over the rights of the French to David Kirk at Quebec in July of 1629. And this is a version of what it might have looked like. Champlain is returned to England. He goes over to the French ambassador and demands that the French ambassador insist on the British that they relinquish Quebec. In 1630, Champlain returns to Brouage, where he has 3 homes, and we're not sure if this is one of his 3 homes, but this is an older styled home in Brouage, and he sells all of his assets in Brouage. One of the homes he sells to his best friend, who has also been a cartographer since youth in Brouage. So very important, this gives him a reasonable amount of cash. With the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye on March the 29th, 1632, Quebec is returned to the French. Champlain also publishes the most important map of the very early period of Canada. And of course it shows Lake Ontario, Lac des Hurons, and Lac Supérieur because it's so big. What he doesn't have, of course, is any knowledge per se of Lake Erie and Lake Michigan, but that will come very, very quickly. So he certainly has the cartographic representation of most of the Atlantic, and from Henry Hudson, Hudson's Bay, and the shape of North America is slowly coming together as a result of his efforts. He suffers a stroke in 1635 in the summer, and on the 25th of December, Champlain suffers another stroke and dies at Quebec City, and he's buried in the church of Notre-Dame de la Couvrance. And so far, an archaeologist by the name of René Lévesque has not found where Champlain's burial actually has been put. The king announces that the next individual will actually be a governor. And so Governor Charles Montmagny in 1636 comes out to New France, and he is designated officially as governor. Champlain was never officially given the title of governor, but in fact for more than 20 years he was a lieutenant. He was a number of different descriptors to fulfill that role. So Champlain's dream and legacy. Sam, like seems to have developed very white hair. as a result of many of the bronzes that have been created to honor him. And what's really great about Champlain, all men are not suited to take the risk. The trouble and fatigue are great, but nothing is to be had without toil. That is one what must think in these affairs. It will be when it pleases God. As for me, I will always prepare the way for those who will wish after me to carry it on. So that basically is Champlain's story.